We have finally come to the start of 1997 and our issue with Nintendo Power with Shadows of the Empire, or in January of 97. And as we've seen in the past, with the new year comes a new visual overhaul for Nintendo Power, so we'll see how the magazine looks this time. Our cover game for this issue is Shadows of the Empire, and we have an alternative cover. Our first, I believe, for Nintendo Power. One with Dash Rendar, and the other with some Stormtroopers. In the letters column, we have some complaints about the inclusion of the Shadows of the Empire comic excerpts, with the writer, once again, not wanting any comics. This is the eternal battle for whenever Nintendo Power has comics in the first place. We have a shakeup in the organization of the power charts this issue. The N64 now has a top 10 ranking, while the Game Boy has dropped to a top 5, which seems slightly odd to me because the SNES is on the way out and the Game Boy is still a ongoing viable system. Now with this expansion, we have Mario Kart 64, GoldenEye 007, and Crusin USA entering the rankings on the N64. First off, we're getting some additional coverage of Shadows of the Empire with tips and notes for each level of the game. Shadows of the Empire adapts the plot of the novel Sun. The novel keeps the focus on the main characters of the Star Wars trilogy, in this case, Luke, Leia, and Chewbacca, plus also Lando Calrissian, with Dash Rendar as a new supporting character moving around the periphery of the story, something as a tease as to whether he would fit the dynamic of our heroes the way Han Solo did, before ultimately reaffirming that while Rendar's a friend, Han's our best bud, and so he's more important. We already knew that because we already made, Return of the Jedi. The game, on the other hand, puts Dash Rendar front and center in the story. He is the character the player controls. Not Luke, not Leia, not Lando, just Dash Rendar, and we only view things from his perspective, including in things which do not show up in the book at all. We control Dash Rendar as we go through the Battle of Hoth, taking down Imperial walkers, and fight our way out of Echo Base before joining in the hunt for Boba Fett and ultimately taking down Prince Shizor. And this has the game go through several different perspectives. We have vehicle sequences, like the Battle of Hoth at the very start of the game, turret sequences like the escape from Hoth on the Outrider, and on-foot and run-a-gun sequences like traversing Echo Base or on Ord Mantell. On the one hand, considering that this is effectively a launch title for the N64, and that 3D console gaming was only really a year old at the point that the N64 came out, the PlayStation and the Saturn had come out a year prior, Shadows of the Empire does an incredibly solid job of presenting a narrative and conveying it well through 3D gameplay. The graphics for the various levels have some more simplistic elements, like basic wall textures, for example, in Echo Base and on the train on the Ord Mantell level. But they all do a very solid job of presenting a sense of place once they've given some dialogue and a sort of Ninja Gaiden style cutscene to get across where you are and what you're trying to do. Where the game stumbles for me isn't the level design or the narrative, it's the play control. And this isn't even like an issue with the N64 controller specifically, it's just how you interact with the 3D environment with the controller. Dash Rendar's auto-aim works well enough for most cases, but in specific cases like boss fights require more precision to shoot the walker for the first boss fight in Echo Base when you're on foot, for example, in the actual cockpit area. That requires you to actually aim, and there it falls short. You can use the Z button for more precise aiming, but the game lacks the thing that you would need to do need to have in order to do the more precise aiming. Crosshairs. Now, this is definitely a case of where we're at in 3D gaming causing problems, because we're at a point where none of what we think of now when we think of 3D games in terms of game engines and middleware really exist yet. We have no Unreal Engine. If you've been reading my recaps of Next Gen Magazine on the blog, Quake is either not out or barely out yet. Quake 1, that is. So the Quake engine is not available for game developers. Duke Nukem 3D is out, but Duke Nukem, much like Doom, did not have crosshairs. Both Duke Nukem and Doom use a fairly generous degree of auto-aim for when it comes to shooting at enemies. As long as your character is pointed in appropriately the right direction when you're using a hit scan weapon, the game will generally correct to have you shoot at whatever it is that the nearest opponent is, or where the gun is pointed, and including correction on the vertical axis as far as targets that are higher or lower on the map, which in the case of Doom, higher and lower is something of an illusion, so to speak. So honestly, in the case of Shadows of the Empire, doing all this in a 3D perspective, it makes sense looking in historical context for why this is something where they might necessarily have not thought that part through yet, or further, because this is less of an issue that players would have been running into at the time. It's still an issue, though, coming at it and approaching the game now, because we expect that. It is a general quality of life feature that decades of games from this point onwards have addressed, and indeed we will see not too far off once we get to GoldenEye 007. But here, it is a problem, and it's, I suspect, a problem that the developers didn't anticipate would be an issue necessarily, or didn't think was too much of a problem. For example, the blaster that Dash Rendar uses has unlimited ammo. We just need to give it a minute to recharge to go back up to full, and that is their way to compensate for this, is you aim upwards, you fire, and if you miss, you can adjust, and your ammo is recharging because you're not permanently being cost or resource at that time. Where this becomes a problem is with the actual, where it becomes the actual use of dealing with this technique in an environment that requires quick movements and action. Additionally, on top of that, the jumping mechanics are just wonky enough that when precision jumps come up, it can be difficult to land them the way you want or need to. It's not like the short little hops that you get for example, Prince of Persia, or will get with Tomb Raider. This is a more swingy, big jump with less of, or if they do a shorter jump, it's just a little bit too short. It operates on the perspective that for a shorter hop, you would just run over it, the gap, as if it wasn't there, like you would for example, Doom. So I absolutely understand why Shadows of the Empire stuck with players at the time, and why those players have such fond memories of it now. It is a decent game. It has aged, as I've described at length, poorly in some respects, particularly when it comes to the control of running and gunning in a 3D space. But those are control issues only. Graphically, it's alright. If the issues that the game has are very much strictly those of the growing pains as the game industry is moving more and more heavily into the idea of designing games in 3D spaces and figuring out how the player is going to interact in that, and in particular on a console. Next up, Nintendo is putting on their own trade show, Shoshinkai, or Space World. Outside of an overview of upcoming titles, including screenshots of some of the games, including Earthbound 64, which doesn't come out, we also get a look at the N64 DD and a preview of the Rumble Pack, which at this point is known strictly as the Jolting Pack. There's also a group interview with Takashi Tezuka, Shigeru Miyamoto, and Hideki Kano of Nintendo about upcoming titles and how they take advantage of the new tech on the N64, along with the Jolting Pack, which, like, honestly, this is the whole gist of the whole article, really, is how games are taking advantage of the N64's hardware. And sticking with N64 games, we now have the N64 version of NBA Hangtime, our first real direct ports of the same game, as opposed to variants on a game, between the SNES and the N64. The guide repeats a lot of information from the article for the Super Nintendo version of the game. NBA Hangtime on the N64 is, for better and worse, a lot like the SNES version of the game, but with better graphics. The same rubber banding is there, the graphics are significantly improved, the audio is about the same. Where the game stumbles some is with the controls. The game maps some of the defensive moves to combinations of the A button and some of the direction of the C directions on the N64 controller. The problem being that those buttons are, unfortunately, too far apart to pull those combinations off successfully or effectively. And this is actually particularly distressing considering how well the SNES version did on that controller, combined with the fact that the game's only really using 3 buttons. Frankly, remapping the controls to just strictly use directions of C directions for passing, shooting, and defense would probably have been fine. But however, it also would have broken with convention with using the B and A buttons on Nintendo controllers. Enough so that it almost makes me wonder that if there were like specific requirements for cert on N64 games that required you to use the A and B buttons in gameplay specific situations, not just menu navigation. Even if it would have made more physical sense from an ergonomic standpoint to focus on the C buttons. The Shadows of the Empire comic continues, and as a note, since I haven't gotten into this too much, because these are all short excerpts of individual comic issues, as an incentive to pick up the comic, as opposed to serializing an issue of the comic within the magazine. Which is why, if you're looking at these screenshots and it seems like they're jumping all over the place, that's because it is. It's not doing a contiguous narrative like we got in the past with the Zelda Link to the Past comic, for example. In the classified information column, we have some big teleporter codes for Might and Magic 3 on the SNES, and I believe a bunch of these also carry over to the PC version as well. So if you were playing the PC game and went over to the SNES version, you had a bit of a leg up there. Mario Kart 64 is out in Japan, but not in the US yet, so we get some advanced coverage of the game using the Japanese version for a preview with a full article coming later, so I'll cover it then. There's a rundown of some of the new mechanics and descriptions of each of the stages, along with another interview with Kano from Space World, with Hideki Kano being one of the lead designers on the game. We have more coverage of Crusin USA, with strategies for each level and information on the upgrade system, where the vehicle that you use is upgraded each time you beat the game on a escalating difficulty. I've previously reviewed this game, so I'll refer you to that episode. In Counselor's Corner, we have probably the biggest visual shift that we've had so far of the various chunks of the magazine. Though to be fair, Counselor Corner has always felt like it's had the more dramatic overhauls, more so than classified information until recently. With the main tip here, or advice here, being tips from Mario 64. We have some more coverage for Donkey Kong Country 3 with notes on that game's bonus world, which is structured similarly to the Star Road from Super Mario World. The Super Nintendo is not quite done yet with Magic Boy, a platformer. We have notes for most of the game's levels, which appear to be more vertically oriented. Magic Boy is another Amiga platformer, and a dated one as well. From my research, the Amiga version of this game came out in '93, and we are now 4 years later in 1997. While the game doesn't have the same level of floatiness with its movements that other Amiga games have, it compensates for that in a negative way, with similar issues with this sort of slidey animation issue where the characters will just seem to, after a jump or while moving, just kind of keep going in a particular direction, but without having any movement animation to go with it as well, like for example Mario does. The game also puts more focus, again, on vertically oriented level designs instead of horizontally oriented ones. However, this introduces a new problem, that the orientation of the levels, particularly without any sort of ability to easily aim the player's shots vertically, consistently, in advance of the player's movement on that axis, either up or down, means that you're going to end up taking some cheap hits, as you're not able to clear your path for your movements. Which leads to another major problem in that you die in a single hit, forcing you to start the entire stage over from scratch, and without any sort of power-up available that would give you that additional hit. It makes for a game that is tremendously unforgiving, aggravated by the fact that at this point in the evolution of video games, as in when this game came out, even on the Amiga, myriad developers before them, even going all the way back to this NES, had come up with all sorts of ways to mitigate the frustration issues that this game has while still retaining a sense of difficulty. It shows a marked issue with Super Nintendo games at this point, with developers who have the tools and budget to develop 16-bit games, and who are doing so to capitalize on the market of Super Nintendo customers who at this point who are unwilling or unable to get one of the new generations of consoles, be it N64, be it the PlayStation or the Saturn, and the void on the Super Nintendo publishing schedule that would have been occupied by the various big names who have then moved to those new consoles, again, Saturn, PlayStation, and 64, and are dedicating their resources to those systems. In this case, it's developers porting existing games, in this case from their back catalog, for 16-bit consoles, like 16-bit computers like the Amiga, and moving them to the Super Nintendo, possibly also the Genesis, without giving thought necessarily as to how games have progressed over the course of those few years, or even just acknowledging the limitations or differences of the controller hardware that's involved. It's frustrating. Our last game this issue is Casper, based on the mix of live action and animated children's film. The article doesn't quite make it clear what the structure of this game is. Is there linear levels? Is this a Metroid clone? Is this Amiga style sort of aimless free roaming with no traversal upgrades or anything like that, like with the Ocean Addams Family games? That doesn't really make that clear. So, Casper for the SNES, after doing some digging for this version of the game, but not including the Japanese version, which is for the Super Famicom, has a core fundamental problem. This game is built off of the Boy and His Blob engine. That's not the issue. The issue is, it is also a moderate combat sort of semi-Metroidvania, where you pick up different toys in the level, which will let you, as Casper, which will let you change your form to allow traversal past different obstacles and to overcome certain enemies. The problem being, Boy and His Blob doesn't do combat well. It does navigation very well, same with puzzles, but not combat. Indeed, Boy and His Blob, the best levels of the game are combat light. It's more about navigating the environment than overcoming obstacles that way, as opposed to fighting enemies. If this were strictly a puzzle and traversal-based game, which was based around having Casper navigate the environments of the mansion, picking up items which would allow him to transform and help cat make her way as well, sort of an inverse boy and his blob relationship, where you're controlling the blob and the human follows your cues. That would be great. That would be a really fun, solid game, and one which I would argue fixes a lot of the problems of the original Boy and His Blob, combined with the idea that with this structure, you're not dealing with a finite number of jelly beans to work with, and so you can't, in the course of experimenting to solve a puzzle, accidentally put yourself in a situation where the game is unwinnable. Which is, again, considering that this is based on a children's film, a kid's film, and this is going to be a game that theoretically kids will be asking their parents to pick up, would make this game more approachable for those younger audiences. Instead, they stuck a whole bunch of combat in there because video games, I guess, and some of the developers said, well, it's a video game, we have to have combat, right? And in the process made the game a mess to play, and ultimately less fun overall. In the Beat the Boss column, we have a whole bunch of final boss strategies with, I noticed, a whole lot of Game Boy titles taking the focus. In the Now Playing column, we have not really any also-rans, but instead we do have a whole lot of Game Boy re-releases. And speaking of which, we have a whole slew of additional notes on all these upcoming Game Boy re-releases that are coming out just in time for the to come out of the holiday season. In Pak Watch, we have a bunch of upcoming first-person shooters, including not just Turok and GoldenEye 007, but also Hexen. So we only had 4 actual games to review this week, not including stuff that's coming up in future weeks, or is getting, or we've, already covered. So of those, my pick is Shadows of the Empire. That said, if somebody watching this were to come up with for PC version that you can get on GOG, or as a patch to the ROM if you're playing it on emulator, or using a flash cart, or when the appropriate addition to the Polymega comes out, to add a crosshair to your view, or when you, at least just only when you press the Z button for precision aiming, this would make the game so much better. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe. And also consider backing my Patreon. Patreon backers get episodes up to 1 week early of this show and any future Let's Plays. Also, please consider backing my Ko-fi. Tossing me a few bucks also helps support the show, and it's not a monthly obligation or anything like that.